Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome Dr Suzanne Brown to the podcast. Suzanne, really great to have you on board. Welcome, and might be worthwhile just sort of starting the ball rolling, really. I know it's a quick conversation just before we actually started recording, but it'd be useful to just find out a bit about you and your background and the things that you do.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure. So I'm a clinical psychologist, currently working half-time in the NHS and then half-time in private practice. So what a clinical psychologist really does is work with people who present with any kind of psychological distress. And the kind of flip side of that is we're not just working with distress, but we're also trying to help people thrive and, be the best that they can be. So I tend to work with a lot of mental health presentations that you've probably heard about, things like anxiety, depression, psychosis, self-harm, eating disorders, any kind of psychological distress. And then privately, I'm currently doing a lot of work in sports as well. So working with various sporting organisations, thinking about the environment, working with coaches, working with players, and doing some workshops around both sort of mental health and I suppose making environments psychologically informed.
This is, as you're probably aware, with the podcast. Obviously, we were introduced by a long-time podcast listener and good. I suppose good. How do I describe him? He's I feel like sometimes we have some jousts on Twitter, but it's really good-natured and inquisitive. Dan Cottrell, who's obviously does stuff with Rugby Coaches Weekly, and he's got a very inquisitive mind, and is part of my learning group. So I'm grateful to Dan for putting us in touch. This is a really interesting area for me on lots of different levels, and it's something that I feel in the talent space in particular has been. What's the word I'm looking for? Has been sort of underappreciated as an area that requires coaches in particular to have much more of a knowledge of, because not just nowadays, I think this was always the case. I think it's just the awareness of it is higher nowadays, that young people, are facing quite significant challenges in terms of navigating through the landscape of sort of talent development, striving to reach their potential. It's really quite stressful, I imagine. I know it is. And so not having the kind of tools and way of dealing with that is quite a challenge for coaches. And I think sometimes they come up against it and don't quite know what to do and sort of hope for the best and feel a little bit unprepared for what they're trying to tackle. So I just wonder, in your work, I mean, and obviously we can go in different spaces here, but particularly when the work you do with coaches, what are you finding they're talking to you about, and what are the things that you're doing with them to sort of support them and then help them support the athlete, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I agree. I think it's becoming a much more visible thing in sport, which is great. So particularly around the coaches, I guess one of the main things I end up talking to them about, and I think this is something Dan and I think it piqued his interest, which is probably why he then put me in touch with you, but trying to understand not just how they're navigating the landscape of talent development, but navigating the dual landscape of what it means to be, working through often adolescents at the same time, which brings with it a whole host of changes, particularly in the brain, in the body, and on top of that then, so what happens when you've got a group of, 15 kids in front of you, and trying to understand the individual responses to the same coaching method? So why is it one child will be more resilient? Why is it one child will struggle more? And so we ended up talking a lot around attachment styles. So understanding how your very early relationships, often with your parents, really go on to shape how you make sense of yourself, how you make sense of other people, and then what you come to expect from the world. And then building up, because we all experience different types of trauma, so throughout our life. Some of us have more cumulative trauma, so trauma that adds up. Some of us might have things that are quite catastrophic in terms of trauma. And again, how that impacts, because I often say adolescence is both a time of opportunity, but it also can be a real time of vulnerability because of all the changes that are happening within the brain. So it's about how to really work with the whole child, the whole person in front of you. And again, when we're talking about brain changes, the other thing I was talking to Dan about was, they don't stop when you hit 18. I think people think of adults as, that magic number. Brain changes carry on well up until your 30s, and our brain remains really flexible throughout life. So, it slows down, but particularly, from adolescence all the way up to 30, you're having major, huge changes. There's kind of this pruning process going on where you're strengthening the kind of connections between the parts of the brain that you're using often, and you're kind of getting rid of the ones that you don't need. So every single interaction that you're having will be having an impact on the child that you're working with, which tends to blow people's mind a little bit. But I think it's a really great way of thinking about how important your interactions with people are.
So just walk me through that a little bit more, because I think this is probably news for some people, or at least I think this is an area that needs to be understood more. In terms of that adolescent brain, and I think might be parents listening to this, so this might be really useful as well. So in terms of the adolescent brain, I've heard Vincent Walsh talk about this as well, about the changes that happen in the brain. But it'd be, almost like, I know it's a complex area, but like a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the type of things that happen with, young people as they go through those sort of middle teens areas. It strikes me that the time in which we ask children to invest the most in their development is the time at which they have the most things happening to them on a kind of neurological and hormonal level. So it's really important to know about.
Yeah, so I agree. And this is why it's also a time of opportunity if you get it really right, because it can actually be a catalyst to like many great things. So particularly thinking around kind of the reward and risk centers in the brain, they're particularly heightened. They're really sensitive during the teenage years. So in fact, if you think about that from a sporting perspective, that's the time where you want kids to take risks. This is the opportunity to learn, to go out, have a go, and then be able to feel safe enough to have a go. And if it doesn't go well enough, to try again. Teenagers are very risky during this period, which is also why there is a huge sort of increase in terms of injury and sort of accidental death as well, because the way that their reward center in the brain is working is it's really heightened. So it's not necessarily always about receiving the reward. And again, this is really important when you think about team sports and being involved in this kind of environment. It's the anticipation of the reward that kind of really motivates kids at this age. Other things like their social and peer group become so incredibly important. And if we think about this from kind of an evolutionary point of view, this is the time when, many years ago, you'd be kind of setting off into the world. And so that's another really important thing for, again, both risk taking, but going out and exploring your environment. At this age, this is when your body is primed to begin to start doing that. So what tends to happen is, and again, it's not to say parents don't play a huge important role, because they really do, but lots of parents who are probably listening to this will know very much the kind of experience of having a teenager that tends to then withdraw a bit more from them and very much focus on their peer group and their friendship group. So really thinking about motivation, group belonging, what it means to be part of the pack, is really important at this time. And then how you use that, how you help teens with that. And it's also why not fitting into the group, kind of feeling isolated and rejected, is incredibly painful at this time as well. And then you've got all sorts of other things happening. So one of the other things I've spoke a lot to people like Russell Earnshaw, who I know you've had on the show, and John Fletcher, and we've had lots of conversations about play during this period. So I think there's a sad reality that as we get older, we really stop playing so much, and yet it's such a wonderful opportunity, because play gives us so many rich learning experiences, not just as a child, but again, how you cope with winning and losing in play, how you're able to, again, sort of take risks, how you're able to then communicate in groups. Play really helps you pick up lots of new skills. And again, it's all dependent on the environment in which you feel safe enough to do that. So one of the other things I've talked a lot about is that kind of safe uncertainty that's probably spoken a little bit more about now, which is a model that is available on the website if you want to have a look at it. But it really pieces together thinking about theory from family therapy, as well as sort of theory from psychodynamic background, about how actually it's so incredibly important that we often confuse our sense of a need for safety with a need for certainty, and that's just not the case. What we do need is we need to be safe. What we don't need is permanent certainty, because actually that's when we kind of go on to autopilot and switch off, and you're less likely to be able to learn in those types of environments. They're more rigid, they're less flexible. And if you just think about all then the changes that are happening that we've just talked about, kids particularly can feel really constrained, and this is actually a real great opportunity for them to become more autonomous, so for them to kind of take the lead. And I do think we're missing huge opportunities in this arena, with things being so regimented and structured. I really think children, and actually sort of when you're thinking about it at the elite end of things, it's not that we sort of teach people about how to kind of win. We give them the opportunity to kind of take those leadership skills on, to really embrace that. And you don't learn that from being told it, you learn it from doing it. So then, coaches often get really frustrated when children aren't doing what it is, and not just children, adults aren't doing what it is that they're kind of shouting from the sideline about. And yet the reality is, if you're not given the opportunity to learn it, it is a skill. Again, it's something that, in the brain, you're having to develop. If you're not given the opportunity to that, and you're just told what to do all the time, can you really blame kids when they're not able to do it for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, blimey, there's so much in there. I'm a fundamental, as you know, I'm a big advocate for creating kind of a positive learning environment for young people. Mm-hmm. But I believe that the challenges that presents for a lot of people make it, I think they feel like it sort of fits in the too hard box. And I'm interested to know whether, is that just a lack of awareness? Is it and because of a lack of awareness, does it therefore manifest itself in a lack of skill? Or is it linked to some what I would imagine what I consider to be culturally resilient beliefs around the way a young person's learning experience should look like? What I mean by that is, I rail against our education system all the time. And the reason I'm doing that is because I believe, like I think a lot of people have said, it's not me who said this, but people like Sir Ken Robinson talk about our education system being designed for the needs of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, and it's about order and structure, and it's about a mechanized world where individuals go into a, kind of like an industrialized setting. There's no need for real creativity or anything like that. It's literally just be able to, turn the widget to make it, turn the lever to make the widget or whatever,
Yeah.
But the point is, we have an education system that's done that, and then therefore I think people feel like in order for the sport experience to be somehow legitimized, it needs to look or feel like that, so that it's it's serious, it's proper, it's organized, it's structured. And your point about organization and structure, I think, is that very thing. There's this idea that young people, it's like, right, it's about discipline, it's about this, it's about that, it's about the other, and if we don't have that, then we can't move and we can't get this. And that's very much almost like the antithesis of the world we're trying to create, which is one about expression, freedom, joy, love, connection, exploration, creativity. So these are all the things that we feel like, but it seems to just, it kind of grates against this sort of cultural backdrop of what it means to, I don't know, be a serious individual within a system. And this basically, and this manifests itself in lots of ways, that lots of elements of the sports system. It's like, even like how coaches are educated, your session must look like this. And it must have structure and order and all that. Otherwise, you are not deemed to be a competent coach. Yeah. And so I feel like it's everywhere. And here I am on my podcast talking to you going, oh, let's have more freedom and safe to fail and safe uncertainty and all that sort of stuff. And I reckon a lot of people go, oh, yeah, definitely. How? Yeah. So I'm kind of interested just to sort of get your reflections of what was just a lengthy diatribe.
Now I feel like there's a lot for me to get into there. That's really meaty. It's great. Yes, I think we agree on a lot of points there, and definitely, particularly, sort of Ken Robinson is definitely a sort of a thought leader in that field. And I often wonder about this. I wonder, whose anxiety is it for? So why is this the certainty that, because that's it. We do need structure and containment, and those are really important things that allow us to feel safe. So I'm not saying we go the opposite way, which is where it's so unsafe and you're kind of out on a limb and you're not quite sure what you're doing and it's unsafe practice. I think there's something very important about having containment, which then allow people to take risks and allow people to be sort of more free and expressive. And I love the fact that you were talking about love and the feelings behind this, because this is the other thing that really gets missed, and I'm an emotion focused therapist, so when I hear anyone say this, I think I light up, and it's a conversation that needs to be had, because emotions are not a bad thing. They're all selected through evolution for an adaptive purpose, and somehow we've kind of made them into good and bad. And again, that's about us not tolerating complexity. That's about us trying to, I think this is the other part then that kind of, it must look like this for your structure of a coaching session. Again, who is that for? If you are creating a coaching session that you can't then take in and be flexible, then you're not really being present in the room. And I liken it because I think there's such a huge crossover between therapy and kind of being present in the room, and as a coach what you're being asked to do. So if you are kind of going in and responding to somebody as they were last week and you're not able to be present and see what's in front of you, then you're not really having a live interaction. You're responding to the past, and that therefore can't evolve, that can't grow. Whereas if you're able to go in, and I think this is then about that anxiety regulation, because the session structure, I think back to when I kind of first started my training, and I would be similar. It's about our own anxieties. I'd go in with these sheets, and then inevitably within about the first few minutes they would get put to one side and I'd felt a bit more comfortable and able to be present. And I think it's about the recognition that these are coaches that are doing, incredible amounts of work, incredible amount of passion and commitment and dedication, and numerous hours above and beyond the job that they are asked to do. And always striving to do their best. I often think, a lot of what happens comes from a very good place, but it can unfortunately get skewed. So I think people often, I've certainly spoken to some coaches who have talked about not wanting the kids to have the same experience they did, particularly when we think about sort of first team environments, that actually they can be quite brutal, they can be quite harsh, and this idea that we need to prepare kids for that. And then unfortunately what happens is the preparation for that ends up really being sort of a parallel mirror reflection of what it is they're trying to avoid. And this idea that we'll be preparing them in this way, when actually what we do need is a system that responds to people like human beings, that recognizes that we have feelings, that we are learning. It's a time of growth and maturation, and that we mostly learn by getting things wrong, and that is how we learn. And therefore being able to help nurture and guide that. You know, a coach's role is really around, and I do think the very elite, at the elite end, is really about facilitating, you know, genuinely believing that this person has the capacity to do this, and you're helping, you know, get that out. It's not about having to fill them with things. We come kind of curious and ready to engage in our world and want to explore. And often I think it's the obstacles that then people put in the way that really, you know, coaches are really trying to move out of the way to allow that expression that's already there.
It's why it's one of the reasons I'm so drawn to, and people accuse me of being dogmatic and evangelical, and to be honest, I'm quite happy to take that on board if I'm honest. I'm so kind of drawn to the kind of the whole idea of an ecological approach to human development, if you like, because for me it's around, I feel anyway, it's around saying there's an environment here, and in this environment you are, you know, you are, it's okay to feel like this, you know, it's okay to be curious, it's okay to stumble, it's okay to you know, it's supportive, it's challenging, you know, there's, you know, one of my only rules in the environment is you're just not allowed to do what you know you can already do. You know, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's some time for that, but in general, you know, and sort of creating that kind of environment, and then allowing people to sort of and then, you know, creating a kind of problem or something like that just for them to solve. I'm very, very drawn to that idea. Whereas I think a lot of, again, I think stimulated a little bit by education, the landscape in sport is around input. So I think, and this stems from me anyway, from this information model, information processing model of human development, around this idea of, I'm going to give you information that you're then going to process and turn into a motor output, or an emotional. In a sports psychologist, and I'm going to tread carefully here because this is where we start to maybe criticize parts of the profession, so I don't want to go there. But anyway, you know, for me, it's felt a little bit like that. And I've worked in the landscape with a lot of different people in your field, but in what I might call a sport, you know, more traditional sports psychologist perspective. And it feels to me like it's almost like, here's some stuff that I'm going to give you to help you to manage through this. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, in the sense of, I do think tools are useful to help navigate this space, but often it's done with the consequence of sort of an immediate performance output. And that's the bit that I think I sort of struggle with. I prefer to create an environment where we can explore how we respond to certain stimulus, and then begin to understand what our kind of natural approach to this is, and then begin to refine how good we are at that. So I'd just be interested to see, you know, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think there is a time and a place for the tools. I think if you think about, so I suppose what comes to my mind is you potentially working with, you know, if we look across the wide, broad range of it, coaches that have had a huge amount of life experience and different experiences. You've then got children, adults that have also, you know, as an athlete, had a huge amount of life experience, and that could be very different. Then kind of bringing them together, asking kind of the coach to then think about, how am I going to tailor a session to 15 different individuals, or to, you know, however many different individuals, that I think there's that time pressure, the reality of the time pressure. But I also think it happens as it comes from above as well. So there's have you got the luxury often of creating an environment where you know that in the kind of the longer outcome, this is going to be much better for the holistic well-being of everybody involved, not just the athlete, but the coach, that, you know, everybody. Or is it that we live in this quick win, quick fix society that actually, if it's not done now, well, then you're sacked? And that is the reality. That's what happens, you know. So I understand it's a really difficult balance to get. And I think when you think then about the kids that might be there that have had very different life experiences, some of those tools and strategies are probably the first time they've ever had an opportunity to learn those. And that's why sport can be an incredible buffer in terms of creating relationships, creating unity, creating a place of belonging for children and adults. But you're right, then how do we then look beyond just the quick win and the performance outcome to really appreciate that, yes, it may take a bit longer, but if we give somebody good foundations, then they will go on to be able to do that. They're not mutually exclusive. You know, people who are kind of well-rounded, robust, that doesn't mean that they're never going to have bad experiences, but in the face of adversity, they're able to be kind of resilient, which again doesn't mean that you don't have feelings about it, but it means you have feelings and you're allowed to express them and you know where to go for support. Are much more likely to then go on and thrive and do well. It's not that they exist separately. And I think there is just such a huge focus on winning and outcomes. And I think that does come from this kind of higher up pressure of there's not certainty or safety often. There's certainty that if you don't do it, you'll be sacked, but there's not the safety. And often it takes a real a strong character to be able to say, I'm going to weather that storm, and in the face of that, I'm still persisting with this belief that I know this is the kind of ecological framework that's going to be good for everybody. Because it really does have a ripple effect on staff. It really has a ripple effect on then athletes and players, and also that kind of inability to then ever celebrate your success, right? So if you do well and you then just focused on the next win, because actually it's not safe, it just creates anxiety all around. Then you're anxious if you lose and you're anxious if you win. So how can you win?
It's something that it really just occurred to me as you were talking there around. I do want to circle back to this, which is this issue around the coach and the form of life in terms of their experience, what their experience is, and how that affects them in terms of the environment they create. But before we go there, something else I wanted to talk about, which is it strikes me that when we were talking about creating this environment for young people, given now that people talk, I think, a little bit hyperbolically about a mental health epidemic, but certainly whether it's raised awareness or whether it is actual genuinely that societal and social pressures on young people brought about by an increased connected world and technological world is also causing these additional stresses. Either way, it strikes me though that technology is here to stay. It's not like we're going to roll it back. No one's going to say, right, everyone switch your phones off and everyone's just going to comply. It's not going to happen, is it?
No.
So the reality is that we've got young people living in a hyper-connected world, and at this period in time, social connection, social bonds, group belonging, being part of the pack as you talk about it, is really important. And we can't manage, whether you're a parent or coach, you can't manage the broad network of social groups that these young people are going to engage. But what you can manage is the ones that you are engaged with. And I feel that you could make a social group in the sports context like almost the most positive and powerful tribe, if you like, that a young person can kind of connect with, and it can resonate so many important positive messages about social connection that could be really useful for them in terms of helping them navigate other social connections in other parts of their life, either through the way they influence others or make informed choices about, I don't want to be part of that group because I aspire to be part of this group. Or the other thing I'm thinking about is, I talk about this a lot, is it's almost like creating like a bubble of resilience. So the individual almost begins to understand, right, I can see the signs now. I can see when something's going to affect me negatively and this, that, and the other, and I can kind of navigate my way through it, or I can avoid it, or I can create coping strategies or whatever it might be to help them with this navigation. It's made me think, just as a final point, a sort of fantastic talk by a coach that I was very fortunate to work with for a couple of years, Sarah Kelleher. She's the England under 18 girls coach. And she talked about the environments that she creates for these young people. And what came through loud and clear in this workshop, and I can see this with Sarah, she's a fantastic individual anyway, is how passionate she is about creating this sort of cultural sense for those young people to connect to, and you can see it. They do like quick videos to WhatsApp and share them to each other about how to feel about certain things. And she creates days where it's like connection week, or it's challenge week, or it's grit week, and all these sorts of things. And the girls are very involved in creating a cultural identity for themselves. And you can see how powerful it is, and you can see the bonds that they're creating. And it made me really think, as you were talking about, how important it is to create that, and then the ripple effects it has in other aspects of their lives.
Absolutely. It's profound, isn't it? It's not, and this is why I think, we love sport as well. This is why, even as a spectator, you buy in, because you buy into the culture. That's what hooks you in. That's what, captures you. And also that's what helps foster your love of the game when you're in it. It's not just about your personal performance, particularly obviously in team sports. It's about where do you fit in the group. And, there's so much in what you've just said, and she sounds fantastic. I will definitely check her out. I think that real ability for us to be able to understand that we have two kind of fundamental needs, which are being able to attach and belong, and the other part, which is being able to be independent and kind of create our own pathway. And both of them kind of need to be in balance and harmony, because at any point that you sway too much to one side, either you give up what it means to be an individual to just solely belong in the group, and you lose your sense of self, which isn't healthy, or you go the other way, which is actually you're so independent, you actually become a bit isolated from the group. You can't kind of find your way in the group. So it's really about creating that harmony of that middle position. And I think in terms of then what it means to, when you were talking, I was sat there thinking how that changes and that transitions throughout your time. Let's say you're playing with, you're going through the academy process, how your position changes within the pack, so that actually maybe you start off in more of a kind of, if we're going to kind of use those terms like alpha and beta, that maybe you're more of a beta position, and it's through all of those things that you gain about being part of that team, part of that learning, your own kind of sense of confidence, that actually you move then more into a different sphere where you're able to kind of push yourself forward. And then the role modeling you're providing, and this is something I really think would be lovely if it happened more cohesively throughout kind of sporting environments, is that the older ones really are the role models for the younger ones, because the younger ones are naturally drawn to that. That's what they're looking at. They're naturally drawn to their peers at that time, and I think there's such an opportunity to then create more of a cohesive team feel, where actually then there's I think there's something about, it's not as a coach that doesn't mean you're doing a good job or you're not coaching well. I think as a coach, sometimes it's leading from the back, knowing who's going to be the best person, who's got the best relationship. That isn't always us. And often, in my role as a psychologist, I'll say the same. You can have, whether it's a sports psychologist or a clinical psychologist in the team, they may not be the best person to be providing this information. It's about having an eye on who has that best relationship, because, I know Sophia Jowett does a lot of work in this area, and we'd be very much in agreement. The relationship really is the medium in which, things are expressed. This is how changes occur, being able to be in relationship with another. We rely so much on something called like a reflected appraisals. How is it that you see me? And from you seeing me that way, that helps me to make sense of who I am. And this is something that, again, is innate within us, that we need kind of the understanding of the other to help us make sense, to help us organise our brain, the way that our brain structure make sense of who we are and what we do.
Wow. My problem is that I feel like there's just so many avenues to follow, right? But I really want to ask you some questions about that. But let me just, I did say I was going to circle back to this thing about form of life, because I do think this is an area that I do want to explore with you, because obviously we talk about coach as individual with responsibility to establish environments for athletes. However, you also mentioned around the other people around the team, and the other people involved in the coaching group. So one of the things that I've discovered, and this is more of an observation than anything that I can say empirically. However, I believe that in a performance context, so let's say we're in a, you maybe part of a national team, or you've got some sort of, you're in a premiership club, professional environment, where, for example, the stakes are high, like you say, and employment and all those sorts of things become, quite, are dependent on results. Then there are certain behavioural things and environmental challenges that can sort of impinge upon a group.
Yeah.
Get that, right? I still believe fundamentally, if you are true to your belief in human development and human thriving, and I do love this word thriving, then I think it is incumbent upon you to, as a leader, to do what you can to minimize the impact on the athletes and all that sort of stuff. But that in itself brings its own stresses. But when you're in a talent development context and you're dealing with, adolescents who, as we've identified, are, have a kind of a swirling whirlwind of change happening to them internally and externally, and then managing all these different complexities. Well, in a talent context, right, you haven't got the same pressure, in the sense that, you're not responsible for the results. Well, unless, for example, you're employed by a certain club and a certain academy where results matter, or a school where results matter, in which case, again, form of life. And I know a lot of people who listen to the podcast are in these kinds of environments, and they're challenged, I think, often by this sort of cultural dynamic of, well, you've still got to get results. And the talent individuals are there saying, yeah, but hang on, if I do that, that comes at the expense of me sometimes having to create the environment.
Yeah.
Now, I feel like it can still be done. I think if you are passionate and committed, passionate and committed to this, then you can forge this path and create these kinds of cultural environments for individuals. But I'm interested to know, in your experiences working in the sports space, firstly, two things really, I suppose. One is, have you experienced any of this? And have you got coaches coming to you with these kinds of stories? I can think of a couple of people who are very prevalent in my mind right now, in terms of Rusty and Fletch, in terms of them staying true to their ideals and how that's challenged them, and that's come at some personal sacrifice. Yeah. But there are others out there in a similar context. So firstly, are they coming to you with those kinds of stories? What are those kinds of stories? And then I suppose the second part of the question is, what can they do in order to stay true to creating this kind of environment and not have the results culture, impinge on the experience they provide for those young people, without it coming at such a significant either economic or personal or emotional or psychological cost to them themselves?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do see this. I do. So it's interesting, isn't it? I think it happens, yes, that actually, and again, where it's directed from, I think can vary. So it's not always, definitely there is an impact from above in terms of what's expected. But I also do think this is where sometimes people's own sense of self-worth can really get very aligned to what it means to win. And, that is to say, it's not that it's just happening across the board, because I do see coaches that are able to tolerate, are able to hold and manage, other people's feelings and, their own sense of self-worth, when actually, I suppose this is where your priorities come in. This is where, what it is that you're prioritizing. Is it that my priority working in a talent development context is that what does that really mean? And Simon Sinek talks a lot about it. What's your why? And because that is fundamental, that's crucial to not just what you do or how you do it. If you don't know that, then I think you're kind of lost really, and you're kind of scrabbling for any resource that comes your way. So if you have a good sense of what it means to you and why you're doing this, what talent development means to you, and why you're so passionate about that, like you say, often that would encompass more of an ecological model. And I think some of that, in terms of then how you help with that, is both kind of that is awareness and education. This, not many people it's certainly something I've presented on, kind of ecological models that are out there, to think about how to encompass the wider person, not just the player part of the person. Because I think you can then get very narrow focused on what that person means when they're in the building in front of you, and you can really forget and neglect, actually, this is just a small portion of their weekly life. That they are a brother, they are a sister, they are, whatever it may be, they have other roles, other identities, and this is key in then helping them in terms of their psychological well-being, because it's also something I've seen where people are so ascribed to this one sense of an identity and role, that actually we all know that life at the elite level doesn't last forever. So then what happens after that? But I'm trying not to digress too much. So coming back to what you've said, in terms of then, yes, I do see it, and I think it's really key that coaches are knowing why it is that they've gotten into this in the first place, are able to I suppose you talking about sort of Rusty and Fletch, it does take a not a thick skin, and it's a shame that that would be the case, but it does take a lot of self-belief, and I think really being connected in with other people. So hence why I think the Magic Academy that they've created has had such a huge response. People really want to be connected into this. You want your own sense of support, because it can be really isolating when you feel like you're the only person out there singing this tune, and you're kind of banging your head against the wall thinking, how is it that other people don't see this? But again, I think this is where trying to understand where it's coming from, like I said, I've often seen it really genuinely is coming from a good place, it's good intentions, but that actually it ends up being done in the wrong way. And so it's trying to then separate out, well, what is it you're hoping to get from this lesson that you're trying to teach, in terms of preparing them for the first team, and how can we do that in a way that then meets their needs and meets them where they are? So whether that is emotionally, chronologically, because that's the other thing, you might have a 6 foot 15-year-old in front of you, but emotionally he may be much younger, and so trying to then tailor that's where it becomes really individual. Trying to tailor that to the person you've got in front of you it is where then you can kind of get those shifts and get that movement. But I think it is hard, I'm not going to lie. I don't think it's an easy thing to try and then kind of, I suppose, face of the people that have a very different belief around what it means to win, even in a talent development context.
Yeah, that for me is one of the reasons why I think it's so important for those people who understand or are developing talent systems, I suppose. I think this is really important to understand around the nature of the human experience, and again, using ecological modeling, if you like, understanding how the kind of almost like that at that sort of societal level, how that then impinges on that almost at the local level, and how that then impinges on the individual, and all these things bearing down. So if societally, if you like, and from a sports context, let's talk about system building. If your system, your talent development system, is heavily reliant on, let's say, schools, and in some cases it's private schools, and those private schools, in some cases, again, I'm not going to generalize, but in some cases a big part of their, I guess, way of promoting their sports opportunities for young people as a way of attracting people to come to the school, is often driven by results. Results are the way in which we equate success. So there is a driver for results, and there are lots of behavioral challenges that come with that. And I see, and so as a result of that, what people often come to me with is they often say to me, look, that results thing, I'm never going to get away with that. There's no way I can go to my head. There's no way I can go to a group of parents and just say to them, look, don't worry about results. It doesn't matter. We lose every week, but look how amazing these young people are, and look at the way they're growing. Just doesn't wash. And I'm like, okay, so I'm saying, so here's my thing, right? What else can you prize, and how do you go about creating an environment within your scenario, within your tribe, if you like, or your village, that what is it you prize? What are you going to and how are you going to celebrate and champion all the other things that you prize, so that the winning bit and the result bit just becomes one of a list of things that are important within that culture that you're fostering.
Yeah.
And there, because at the moment the only thing that matters is the winning and the performances. And I'll give you a simple example of that. I coach an under 11s cricket team, and some people came to me today saying, were saying to me, right, you need to send me through send me through the results, and send me through who got the most runs, who got the most wickets, who did this, who did that. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
I said, I'm not even going to send you the results, but okay, maybe I will. But I really did. I mean, I did fire again. I said, you can get them if you want, but I'm not posting them on a website. I'm not interested in providing the results and all that sort of stuff. What happens is there's a group of young 11-year-olds, 10-year-olds are going to come along, and they're going to play some cricket, and they're all going to have a good time, and some of them are going to score some runs, and some of them aren't, but no one really cares about it because we've all had a really good game of cricket. I said, the only thing I might do if I'm going to celebrate anything like this is I might celebrate people's contributions. So I might celebrate, somebody who has batted well today. But the reason they batted well might be they didn't score loads of runs, but they helped somebody else to score runs by just sort of, staying in and not getting out, or maybe running some singles and helping other people get in. So I might have that kind of thing because I want to prize the teamwork element, because we've got a set of values that we've created for each other, which is sportsmanship and teamwork and dedication to each other and commitment and all those sorts of things. And I prize them. And actually, I'll give you my returns on that. I'll say who was the most committed this week, and which individuals displayed great teamwork and sportsmanship. I'll give you that information. Of course, that just falls on dead ears, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think that when you were talking, it's very much about that value-driven behaviour. And I think this is something that is really key in terms of trying to change the narrative around what sports means, because I think, again, also there can be a real divide between parents of athletes and then kind of how they're perceived, and also how much they're linked in with coaches or, staff around the child or adult, but really promoting what it means to be value driven, and when is it that you're moving towards them and when is it you're moving away, but beginning to then create that culture where you are celebrating the value-driven behaviour. And I think, again, that is around education, that we, personally in kind of psychology, we have a lot of access around that information. The general public doesn't get access. These are kind of journals you have to pay to subscribe to, and it becomes part of pop psychology. But information such as, internally being motivated is much more likely to lead to reward than external motivators. People that kind of and people do it, but give their children money for taking part in exams or whatever, are much less likely to have children that are internally motivated and therefore achieving well. If you've got an internal motivator, you're more likely to then persevere and persist. And I think it's linking together the elements which then they really value, which are how do you be resilient in sport, to then know that actually if you're coming from an internal motivation point, that actually in the face of failure, in the face of losing, you're much more likely to keep going than actually really find that to be quite catastrophic and completely give up. And I think, again, it's just reconnecting, because we're all subject to media. We're all kind of getting a lot of information thrown at us every single day. Kind of really beginning to foster and form that relationship you're talking about, in terms of kind of having a good relationship between the parents and it not being seen as an either or. Either you have to listen to the parents or you listen to the coach. How is it that we kind of model and create a unity again? And that doesn't mean you all have to share the same opinion, because diversity is, and complexity is a part of life. But how is it that we can foster this sense of values and then really treat it like, and again, I think this comes from, like you're saying, if you genuinely believe that, if you genuinely believe that the ecological model is a framework that is going to be the best thing for that child in front of you, asking parents to really get involved in those processes. What kind of child would you like to have at the end of these 3 years? Is that somebody with a load of trophies in the cabinet, or is that somebody who is a well-rounded individual? Because the reality is that potentially, what is it? I don't know. 95, 96, 7% of kids don't go on to do the elite performance at sport, but look at all these other things that mean they go on to be a well-rounded person that will thrive in whatever area they do want to go into in life, and that sport can be a part of their life forevermore. Like so I recently went, this is very much an off piece now, but I recently went on a rock climbing course myself, not something I've kind of ever really done before. And I can genuinely say the way that, the instructor has inspired a passion in me that wasn't about me kind of making the way up the rock in a certain time, or, it was just kind of the well-rounded experience of what it means to then inspire a love of the sport, or inspire, and I think that's very similar to what people go into coaching for, to help people be the best version of themselves. And that's not just on the pitch, that's creating that holistic approach to a child, which is why I see such a huge crossover between then psychology and coaching, because I think that's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to help people be the best version of themselves.
Yeah, and within that, for me, I love the story. By the way, I think I'm glad you went off piece. That's great.
Okay.
Because for me, that's what we aspire to. In terms of the sort of the work I do day to day, looking at how we can improve and enhance the coaching industry, if you like, it is around. The starting point needs to be the individual experience. So, for me, that's a big win, right? So if I knew who that particular instructor was, I'm not going to necessarily ask for this, but, I think, it's like brilliant, fantastic work, because there's an individual now who has, has had a great experience of what it is to clamber up rocks. And I've done that myself. I've done climbing myself when I was younger and lighter, and it's a great experience. I think, but for me, it's that when you have that kind of experience, it really stays with you and it resonates. But sadly, that isn't the experience for most children. For most children, the experience is, there's an outcome we want, and you are a cog, or you are a part of a machine that is going to try and perform to achieve this outcome, because the outcome validates either our experience or it validates me as an individual, as a coach, and therefore we're driving to that. So what we've lost is this idea of, right, let's give you young people here the most fantastic sports experience possible. Now, it may just be that some of the outcome of that is we can measure in terms of results and performance, because we're in a competitive endeavor. So I get that. Yeah. But that's not the starting point.
No.
And the minute we start to layer it on, the pressure starts to build, and then we move away from what the experience should be.
Yeah, and again, I think you're right. It's about having that as one outcome of many, so that actually we don't become so obsessed with the one. And I think really when you do drill it down to, what parents want for their children, or, as a coach, what you would want for the child in front of you, again, I come back to the fact that everybody is so, passionate and dedicated. They are doing their best. It's being part of a system that is only rewarding one thing, really. And and I wondered how easy it was for you to be able to say to that parent that was requesting that, no, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't know, but it takes a lot on our part to be able to then kind of hold a boundary and say, even in the face of what it is you're asking me to do, I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's in the best interest of the children. I don't handle it that way, funnily enough. Because, again, it's like, it's dealing with the person in front of you. And, I think over the years, I've now begun to instinctively spot who are the people I can deal with on that kind of level. Yeah. The vast majority of people, I think, are really bought into the philosophy and bought into the idea. And it doesn't have to be, I don't have to have parental meetings or anything like that. It's usually done sort of fairly organically through individual conversations that, you can stimulate. This particular one was one of those where I just very much kind of almost just very quietly just shrugged it off, but sort of just said, yeah, to be honest, it's just not something that's that important for this group, because we're just trying to have a great time learning, and I want them to just focus on their cricket and not focus on the results. And then that was it.
that was it, just left it there. And I could see that this particular individual was pretty disgruntled. And there's a bit of history, I know, by the way. I know other coaches in other sports that have the same parent who ask the same questions. You've got two kids who are really good. They're very capable and able. But I also, interestingly, see signs of, in one in particular, of a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And it's really, you can see it's really constraining, because he struggles to challenge and to stretch himself. And interestingly, in my experience, I've seen that a lot as well. I've seen lots and lots of young people come to me, even at kind of 16, 17, 18, and you can sort of see that they've been brought up in a culture that says these are appropriate things to do, these are inappropriate things to do. Do more of the appropriate things to do, less of the inappropriate things to do, and then we will achieve success.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard then, I think, to unravel that. And I found it very, very difficult to get somebody who's sort of been conditioned to an environment saying, this is what you must do, this is what you must do, don't do this, don't do that, to then say, here you go, here's some freedom, here's some opportunity. They're really very difficult for them to get into that mindset.
Yeah, and that freaks people out, because if all you've been told is what to do, because I think then, I know Rusty and I've talked a little bit about this kind of idea of a kid revolution. And actually, often if you ask the children what it is they want, keeping in mind that they are conditioned and brought up in a society that does value winning, but actually if you get them, and I think there's been quite a few videos that have gone around on Twitter, and what they'll talk about is all that value driven stuff. Of course they talk about competition and winning, and that's absolutely okay. It's not to say you can't want to win. Of course you want people to do their best, and that means striving to do your best, but it is one of many other things. And then the other bit that I guess I was thinking about is kind of looping back to what you said, which is this epidemic of actually at what cost does this come at to these people, where actually that's all you've had as your focus in terms of what does success mean to people, and does that mean that you have, I really like the idea of what you said about, the only thing here you can't do is the same things that you're good at, because yes, whilst that might get a quick win, that might be a quick win, that's not the kind of child that's then going to go on to stretch themselves to really step outside their comfort zone and that boundary, and then be able to kind of enhance their learning and knowledge. So if all you're doing is the quick win, then let's say when you're getting to that real elite level, well, actually most people at that elite level are athletic, they're driven, they're motivated. It really comes down to that mental aspect of the game then, doesn't it? How do I perform under pressure? How, those are the bit, how do I perform how do I bounce back from a loss? How is it that, if I've got I don't know, if I'm in the Olympics and yesterday I lost and tomorrow I've got to go back out there, these are the bits that are going to be key in thinking about success and winning. It's not just that, you've won when you were in the academy and during talent development. That well-rounded individual, that person that's had all of those different facets really encouraged to develop, that's where it comes into its element. And that is truly what you're talking about, surely, when you're talking about talent development, having the opportunity and the exploration to try out all of these things. It can't just be about winning at that age, surely not, because realistically, and I'd be interested to know, but surely the trends would say that that's why there is a huge percentage of children that don't make it, and then we need to be holding ourselves accountable for that. And I think that's something that's really important. Are we accountable for what we're doing in these talent development areas? If we're just focused on the winning and success, actually we're potentially letting down a lot of children and adults.
Well, I mean, I think we're even beginning to see this happening in the performance landscape, where I think some of the funding agencies recognise that the costs associated with almost like a win at all costs environment were potentially bringing about undesirable behaviours in performance directors, coaches, people responsible for those athletes' well-being. And so there is now this move, you've probably heard the phrase that people are using, which is medals with morals.
I haven't heard that, actually. I really like that.
Well, yes, but the interesting thing, though, is, and this is where I think talent developers often find themselves kind of at a bit of a kind of crossroads, or they're kind of piggy in the middle. I describe them as piggy in the middle because, on the one hand, they've got a responsibility to foster a love of activity that then those individuals are then going to have a lifelong passion, and they're going to continue with sport and physical activity as being part of their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, they're kind of driven by a performance culture, which is also saying that, you've got to be tough, and you've got to be strong, and you've got to be resilient, and you've got to be, and all of because if you're not any of those things, you're not going to make it at the elite level. And they find themselves in the middle, and there's a bit of mixed messaging coming across. Yeah. Interestingly enough, a lot of talent coaches are, they have aspirations perhaps to work in a performance context. And what they see time and time again is individuals in performance contexts who are the very epitome of those ideals. They are tough, they are strong, they are no compromise, they are, they're decision makers, and and all that sort of stuff. And I see this all the time, these performance coaches who kind of who espouse these particular things. So you can understand how sort of a talent coach thinking, I want to get to that stage.
Yeah.
Keep seeing people getting employed who look like that, act like that, feel like that, going, well, actually, maybe that's the sort of thing that I need to be able to prove to people that I've got what it takes to work in a performance context. Which is why I've often said, actually, being a talent development coach is, in my opinion, one of the most valuable things that you can do. And being skilled and a high quality practitioner as a talent developer is something we should prize. Now, the reality is it's like an hourglass in terms of resources. So in participation terms, most sports are investing loads in getting more people participating. Yeah. And they spend loads of money on making their elite teams good. And then those in the middle, the talent developers, it's kind of like they're just left to their own devices. They get no support, hardly any training, and all that sort of stuff. And they are the ones who are working with the individuals who have the greatest need. Yeah. And it's just like, oh yeah, whatever. And it's the bit that I'm trying. This is one of the reasons I set the podcast up, because I think I've got to try and find a way to help people who are facing these challenges day to day.
Yeah. And again, I think this is where there is a huge crossover between what very normally happens in psychology, and it's the things I've talked to kind of the teams I'm working with at the moment, but that real need for peer supervision. So the fact that you are able to connect, the fact that you're able to support one another, things like reflective practice groups, which happen regularly in psychology and don't happen very regularly in sport, because it's not, and I feel very passionately about this as well, it's not just the athletes who need to be taken care of, these not, and again, I'm saying coaches, but it's anybody who's involved in kind of that sporting arena, physios, strength and conditioning coaches, all of them. You're right, they do such a huge amount for not a lot of money. They are desperately trying to improve and enhance themselves. I know many people that kind of self-fund a lot of the courses that they go on.
Yep.
And so we have a duty of care in terms of thinking about the sporting bodies, or, how you're setting up what it looks like for your staff. One-to-one supervision. So actually having not just peer-to-peer, but having supervision or a mentorship program where you can access people who have had this experience. Because ultimately, if you're not supported and contained, how are you going to support and contain 15 kids? It's a lot to ask of anybody. So there needs to be that support for coaches just as much as there needs to be that support for athletes. And I think otherwise people get burnt out, and then it's so much harder to then, despite with all your best intentions, to hold true to your values and hold true to your beliefs, because there's pressures coming from all angles, and you're doing the best you can to try and just survive it, firefight it, rather than effect genuine change.
Absolutely. I think it's an area that I think has become we're almost kind of only just waking up to it now. By the way, I love what you just talked about in terms of taking care of the coaches and our duty of care to the coaches. And I work very closely with National Agency for Coaching, UK Coaching. They're a very important partner. And we talk about that exact thing, the need for, and not just in talent context, in every context. In actual fact, we're doing quite a lot of work in terms of tackling inactivity. So we've got people who are coaches, probably wouldn't think of them as coaches in the traditional sense of the word, but what they're doing is they're helping people become physically active, and often meeting people with, very meeting people with very difficult challenges. They've either got maybe a long-term health condition, or they face economic hardship, or they've got a mental health challenge, or all these range of things, all things that stop people being active. And individuals who can support them need to be really, really skilled to meet their needs. And so I describe that as a high performance job in a non-high performance context. Yeah. But they get nothing. They get very little support. Like you say, I mean, in your profession, it's common practice to have peer supervision, reflective practice groups, one-to-one mentoring. Yeah. And for me, where coaching needs to go in order to professionalize, and I don't mean professionalize with a capital P, with a small p, the idea of, how can we act as if a profession, whether we consider to be a profession or not, it is to have peer supervision, reflective practice groups, and mentoring and coach development. The in situ support when the problems arise then and there, as opposed to, I'm going to wait for a CPD course that might answer some of my questions. Yeah, and then how do you put that into practice? Because this is the other thing that really gets me. You can go on so many courses, but the reality is the research also shows that so many CPD courses don't really affect change because we're not applying it. So it's not experiential enough. So, there's only so much information you can take in, but what does that look like in practice? So the kind of role play element that I couldn't imagine doing my job without having, and again, sometimes it is self-funded, it's not always supported, but without having supervision, without having like a network of people around me to support me, because none of us exist in isolation. We're trying to do the best that we can, and sometimes at times we all need help with that. And I think that also then encourages, so I liken it to, sometimes there can be a real difference between psychology and nursing colleagues. I was chatting to a colleague of mine yesterday who talked about, actually, you just don't discuss these things. It's expected of you to be okay. Like if anyone asks, like, so how are you doing? Yeah, I'm fine. Is kind of the standard response. It's also quite a British thing, don't get me wrong. I think it's cultural in terms of we ask how people are, but do we really want to know the answer? And so when you're actually allowed to have a space that is protected, and this is the other thing, you have to put it into your program in order to really show that you are giving it a priority, that you do think this is important. And this is, I think, the role of management in these areas. I would agree with you. To actually say that we are investing in you as our staff, we value you, we know that actually you're taking on a lot of emotion in terms of the work that both is asked of you, but that you're getting back from all of these kids. So we value you and we want to support you. And that's how you then have a place where you want to work, you want to go into work, you enjoy work. And surely, again, that ripples out into the work that you do with these children. So on that basis then, would you say that if you were to go in and almost like, let's say you were going to look at a kind of a talent development context, let's say to go to an academy or something along those lines, or you're going to go into an environment where you've got lots of young athletes and sort of senior athletes moving through their development systems, you probably, I think, it sounds to me anyway, in terms of just looking at the individuals leading and managing those environments, some of the ingredients that you would be looking for, almost the first questions would be, so how do you manage peer supervision and support for each other that way? And are there any kind of approaches, whether it's formal or informal, where you can have opportunities for reflective practice in a safe space without necessarily management intervention, so that people have got an opportunity to explore and manage challenges in a group setting? And then finally, how do you facilitate mentoring, so individuals, again, not necessarily within a line management supervision context, but somebody elsewhere where they can actually get support from other people externally to help them either with practice or to help them with just navigating the complexity of dealing with other human beings? And if the answers to that were blank stare, which I imagine they would be, then that's alarm bells, isn't it? Yes and no. So yes, from a perspective of, well, this is where, like, I think the support is needed. No, from the perspective of, I think it's a huge shift, isn't it? It's not something that is
kind of the normal expectation in these domains and these environments. So it has to start somewhere. So I think yes and no, in the sense that yes, it would, you know, these are the areas we really can be supporting people in, and you know, it takes time as well to begin, you know, a shift and a change. So often I'll say, you know, some of the most important conversations I'll have are over a coffee at the coffee machine, or, you know, it's the informal bits that kind of plant the seeds and aren't so threatening, in the sense of, you know, because the idea of actually speaking to a psychologist, again, still in our culture, evokes, you know, fear in people, and yet we're all desperately, you know, wanting it. We were talking a little bit about, you know, prior to the start of this podcast, that actually I think there's been a real well, people didn't expect the response in terms of particularly mental health. And actually what's happened is people have really come forward, and now people in sporting organisations. And I think there's something about having a bit of understanding around that. We're not here to punish people. We're not here to say, well, you don't have this, so this means you're a bad sporting organisation. It's about really approaching it from, well, this is an opportunity then, because you don't have it. So let's go in and look at how we can set that up. Let's see how we can make this a gold standard experience for both staff and athletes. So I see it as an opportunity, because it's not something you just, you know, you're wanting to punish people for if they've never had it. And the culture around, you know, you mentioned it briefly earlier on, but, you know, culturally and societally, if you're saying, I know I've spoke a lot about this in rugby, but, you know, like what your expectation is as a man, what it is that you're allowed to do in terms of gender, about speaking about your feelings, about saying that you've had a hard day at work, or that you're struggling. I don't know what I'm doing with this kid. You know, how often is it people feel they have the permission to say that, and that they're not going to be penalised? Because, you know, given what you said, you should be having your, you know, your plan down to a T, and it should look like this. And so where's the permission to say, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing with that kid? And actually that's a really healthy thing. I often encourage people, particularly in our one-to-ones, to think about, how is it that this person is making you feel? So how do you leave that interaction feeling? Because that is a huge piece of communication that is being communicated non-verbally to you. How does this child leave me feeling? And often that's either it's something about that's hooking into your stuff, or it's a way that, you know, the child is communicating something that they're struggling with. But having a space to go and talk about that, you know, having a space to talk about, and again, you know, I don't like that kid, you know, because you're supposed to, you know, like all the kids that you're coaching, right? And if you don't, or similarly, like, I really like this kid and I really want to do well by him, and I find that actually I'm doing things outside of my normal practice that I wouldn't normally do. What's that about? You know, having a space to have these conversations, which, you know, really, really then increase the visibility and the permission to have that communication in any environment.
And that for me is a really important part of learning. So for those of us who are, you know, on a learning journey, which we are day to day, because you're constantly presented with new ideas and new challenges, having the opportunity to, you know, and again, you know, as close to in the moment when it still feels, you know, live. I mean, is the opportunity when the learning can take place. So we do have a bit of a learning culture in coaching and coach education, that people are going to learn just in case, whereas in actual fact, people need to learn just in time, or at the very least, just after. You know, because we can't always learn just in time. It's not as if I can just reach into my pocket and go, I've got a problem now, I just need to find it. I mean, maybe one day they might be there, but, you know, and I know, but learning is more around us than it ever was. But what I mean is that very often we encounter something, we do our best in the moment. And then we need to be able to sort of either check in with ourselves, check in with others, to go, I did this and I had these intentions, and what do you think? And then you get another pair of eyes, don't you? You get somebody either holding a mirror up and just saying, you know, helping you just to sort of navigate that and all that sort of stuff. And your point is absolutely right, in the sense that I don't expect these talent environments to have all these things in place. I think what I mean is that if we're gonna take care of athletes, we need to take care of the people responsible for the athlete experience. This is something that I believe that has been missing in a lot of the sports experience. The focus is on the athlete, quite rightly, not a problem, right? But we haven't spent enough time focusing on the people responsible for the experience that the athlete has. And they need support too, to help them provide that best experience, because it's a really challenging thing to do. And so the people behind the athlete is now, I think, where we need to start to place some more of our emphasis. And so for me, my dream, for example, would be that we have all these communities. Well, in fact, I was responsible for writing a policy document around coaching, and that in that document we said that we want, by a certain period of time, which is rushing up very fast, we want a percentage, and the starting point is 25%. We want at least 75% of our coaches to have access to some kind of support, whether it's peer support, whether it's peer support, or it's mentoring, or coach development, or it's reflective practice groups. They just need access to that support so that if they need it, there's somewhere to go.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And then the next part of that is how I think each sporting organisation that person is a part of really makes it a part of their programme. So it's not, because this is the other thing, in it's so time pressured, and I hear that from so many coaches. They're doing so much work outside of their normal kind of scheduled and agreed daily job, that actually if we're really saying we really mean it, well, then it becomes part of the program. It becomes part of this is an hour and a half dedicated. The other thing that ends up I think being a great opportunity for whole team learning is sort of team formulation. So kind of thinking around one person that somebody might be struggling with, and then formulating around that, because what then that enables is everybody to learn and skill up the staff. And this is something I say, it's about providing the mentorship and providing the reflective practice groups, but ultimately what you're talking about there is skilling up staff. So again, they're not just reliant on an external means, but they internally build this resource for themselves, and then they can still go and access that, but they're skilling themselves up to then be able to manage. Because you're right, we can't predict every single outcome, and would you want to? You wouldn't. But the ability to then feel like you've got enough resources to do a good enough job in the moment, and then take that somewhere to talk about. But I think it does need to be at a policy level. I think it needs to be something that's put in as a mandatory, so that we are protecting the safety and well-being of the people who are coaching and responsible for 15 kids in one go.
Yeah. Well, it's an ongoing piece of work, but we're one step at a time. Look, I know we're coming up on time. You've got a train to catch, and I've got a conference to get to. I mean, look, as always, and I knew this would be the case. Conversation's absolutely flown by, and we've covered a lot. I know there's a lot more we could cover. So I'm hoping I might be able to steal a little bit more of your time in the future to be able to cover some of the areas that we haven't gone down. It feels like the never-ending story to me. And I also feel really guilty that I've sort of monopolized your time talking about coaching and the talent experience, which obviously is what the podcast is about. But I do think there's a lot of other areas that we haven't been able to cover, which is sort of getting more in depth into that kind of clinical psychology world that you're having, which I feel like I need to explore. So hopefully you might be happy enough to come back to do a part 2.
Very happy. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. No problem.
In the meantime, if people want to reach out and make contact or find out a bit more about what you're doing in this space, how do they do so?
So they can visit the website, which is www.emotionallyconnected.co.uk. So there's some information on there, sort of blogs and information about safe uncertainty in sport, and then contact details are on there, and they can get in touch via email or telephone call.
Brilliant stuff. Okay. You're going to be
also on Twitter well if they wanted to have a look on there. So
I've been following some of your threads with great interest. They are definitely worth looking at, actually. So get into those, because there's lots of quality stuff in lots of different areas. You have a range of interests, I see.
I do. Yeah, no, I do. I think there's such a crossover, and this is what I was saying. There's such a hybrid, and I think genuinely the amount that we can learn from each other if we collaborate, I think would just make it a much better place for all. So yeah, I'm really passionate about that.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm sorry we couldn't cover some of the other areas, but like I said, I think it sets up a really nice part 2, and I'm sure it'll be in very high demand. I love the stuff you're doing. I think we need more people with your skills, knowledge, background, understanding in our space, helping us navigate some of this. And I think actually the fact that I think the sports world has kind of woken up to, taking care of individuals, duty of care, and all those sorts of things, not just athletes, but also the people behind the athletes it's actually a long overdue, it's sort of sad that it's come about in the way it has. But in many ways, I'm glad it has anyway, because I think it's hopefully the sports world becomes a much happier and better place as a result of that. So
I agree.
Great stuff. Thank you, and I'll see you again in part 2.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.